Today, we are talking with a winemaker from New Zealand who is focused on making great zero alcohol wines. Yeah, that's right. You may not be familiar with zero alcohol wines, but they are a growing piece of the market, and there are a lot of winemakers like our guest, Duncan Shouler, who are trying to change people's minds on the quality of low to no alcohol wine. So here we go. Hello, and welcome to the Wine Pair Podcast. I'm Joe, your sommelier of a reasonably priced wine, and for this special episode, I'm on my own as my wine pairing partner in crime is busy making cakes for her Baby Cakes Micro Bakery, which, by the way, you can learn more about if you head over to our website, lovebabykcakes.com. But now, as a quick orientation to our podcast, what we usually do in each episode is learn about, taste, and review 3 wines that are reasonably priced, which means under $20, and should be easy for you to find. However, for this special set of episodes, we interview people who are involved in actually making wine. Because part of what we want to do with our podcast is to educate ourselves and you on different aspects of wine knowledge in a fun and entertaining and unstuffy and even fun and entertaining way, as Decanter Magazine has called our podcast. And that is what we're doing today. And a small plug before we get to the interview with Duncan: if you like what you're hearing or interested in hearing our other regular episodes, please subscribe to our podcast so you can hear more, especially since you're only getting one half of the Wine Pair Podcast in this episode and me. You can also go to our website to send us a note or subscribe to our fabulous newsletter, and you can follow us on Instagram at the Wine Pair Podcast. And if you like what you're hearing, you can leave us a nice rating and review. But for now, let's get on to the interview with Duncan Shouler. Hello, Duncan, and welcome to the Wine Pair Podcast.
Hi, Joe. It's great to be here. How are you?
Oh, so I'm great. I'm great to be talking to you. It's fantastic. So for all our listeners, we have a really special treat. We're joined today by Duncan Shouler. He's the chief winemaker at Giesen Wines, and Giesen Wines is from the beautiful country of New Zealand. And they specialize in zero alcohol wines, and they use an innovative technique called spinning cones to de-alcoholize their wines. I can almost say that, and Duncan's going to tell us all about that and what it means. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the special challenges of making a great zero alcohol wine and how Duncan works hard to make a great tasting wine. And so thanks again for joining us, Duncan.
No, it's a pleasure to be here, Joe, on a sort of a late spring, early summer afternoon here in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's so funny that you said that, because I'm like, late spring. Oh yeah, you're in the other half of the world. We're just getting into winter, so that's awesome.
We're just starting to warm up over here. It's a pretty exciting time in New Zealand because the growing season for all of our vines, of course, is getting underway. So this is the time of year where all us winemakers here start getting pretty excited.
That's right. It's a good reminder. You're starting the season. Everybody over here on this half of the world has finished their season, so good stuff. Well, I'm really excited to learn more. This zero alcohol wine subject is really fascinating to me, but why don't we start out with you telling us a little bit about you, your background, maybe if you want to talk about, your family and where you came from, and then we can talk about your wine adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was born in England, in fact. So although I've lived in New Zealand now for over 20 years, I was born in the south of England and spent most of my youth growing up in the south of England, a little bit in the Mediterranean, in Cyprus. And I always think that's where my sort of early sort of exposure to wine came in living in Cyprus. I remember seeing mum and dad drinking local wines in restaurants, and I'll never forget that. And I always used to have a little taste of the wines too. And then I grew up for a while in Scotland before I finally moved to New Zealand. And I didn't get into the wine industry straight away. As you can imagine, there's not a particularly thriving wine industry in Scotland. So it took me a few years through my career before I found myself in wine.
Yeah, actually, that's a good segue into this question. So you didn't start out, like when you went to college to start your training and studies, you did not start out thinking about going into winemaking. So you did actually marine biology, if I'm not mistaken, and then somehow you got into wine studies. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit of a sort of a roundabout journey. I mean, I had always been very interested in science, growing up as a high school student, and I was fascinated by the ocean and by everything that lived in it. So marine biology for me was a real passion, and I saw it as a career and a hobby of mine as well. So I studied that in Glasgow and then moved to New Zealand in the late 90s, early 2000s, and loved, working in marine biology in New Zealand for a few years. So I used to teach scuba diving and teach some marine biology and do some research, and it was absolutely fantastic. But I'd always had this interest in wine, and I could never quite let it go. I was certainly very interested in drinking it, but I was sort of increasingly becoming interested in how it was made. And in New Zealand at that time, early 2000s, the wine industry was really just starting to get going. Obviously, Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand had been around for a while, and people were starting to pay attention to those wines around the world. But around about 2000 to 2005, the industry really started to grow quite rapidly. And I thought it was a great opportunity to get into the industry. So I left my scuba gear on the beach and went back to university and studied winemaking.
And did you find that your background in science and marine biology was helpful in learning to make wine?
Yeah, look, I think it did because, of course, winemaking, there is a large degree of science to it. You need a science background to be able to understand some of the aspects of it, whether that be viticulture or enology. And I suppose also it's quite a lifestyle-driven career, and you've got to be quite passionate about it, which is quite similar to marine biology. I think people generally don't get into marine biology for the money. It's a fascinating field, but it's something that's driven by passion, and I think the wine industry is very much the same.
So now you studied winemaking, you got your master's degree, and then what was the next step? I imagine your first step was not getting into zero alcohol wines, but how did what was your first step after your studies?
Yeah, look, I it became really clear quite quickly after studying wine that, of course, I did a 2-year master's degree and did a year of theory and a year of research, and that was fantastic. And I came away from that thinking I knew a thing or two about how wine was made and whatnot. But then it was very clear that to really understand how to make wine and how to make good wine and how to learn from people around you, you've got to spend a lot of time traveling and working in different wine regions. So that's what I did. So I set about traveling around New Zealand, France, America for a number of years, making wine in a few different regions, a few different varieties, and under the guidance of some really great winemakers around the world. And that sort of started to build my knowledge and understanding of making wine, and hopefully led to me being a sort of a more dynamic winemaker with a sort of a richer background, I suppose.
And in your travels, as you were learning how to make wine in these different countries, was there anything that really stood out for you, or somebody who really was very influential in you becoming a winemaker, or how you make wines today?
Yeah, look, I think to be honest, everywhere I worked in some way, some shape or form was really influential, and I was lucky that I worked in some really fantastic, very high end producers, and I worked in Saint-Emilion in France at Chateau Angelus, and that was amazing exposure to luxury wine and working with. Emilian de Fulci and Hubert de Bois there was pretty phenomenal. Great names in the wine industry in Bordeaux. And then in over in California, I worked with John Priest at Etude, fantastic Pinot Noir winemaker. Learned a lot from him. And here in New Zealand, a guy called Nikolai St. George, who's at Cloudy Bay. Worked with him a number of years, and he's a great winemaker. And I think what you do is you sort of learn more and more to take little bits from everybody to help mold your own winemaking style and your approach to what you make and how you make it. So to be honest, I think everybody I've worked with in the wine industry in some shape or form has had an influence on how I make my wine now.
So as you were making wines, I'm making assumptions, and I should make assumptions, but I'm assuming that most of your early winemaking was not zero alcohol. Is that correct?
No, absolutely. So zero alcohol has really been the last 3 years. And so my sort of wine journey absolutely started with regular full alcohol wine. And I think when I first got into the wine industry, I was really sort of drawn towards the smaller production, high-end winemaking. And that was great. It really was fantastic. But I think the more I made wine, I recognized that those wines are very important, but as are regular, larger production wines that perhaps reach a larger audience are just as important in a different way. So one of the things I always try to do is try and meld some small-scale winemaking into a larger commercial environment, sort of get the best of both worlds.
And then when you think about how you make wines today, what do you feel makes your wine special or differentiates the way you make wine from other winemakers? Or maybe it's this combination that you talked about.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, and I suppose you got to look at what makes wine special, and I suppose what makes wine special is a number of things. It can be giving the wine drinker a fantastic sense of occasion and a sense of place. You're tasting the region or the country where the wine comes from, and certainly bringing a style of wine that is a great lifestyle sort of choice, where the wine can go very nicely with food. For me personally, I more and more, the longer I've been in the wine industry, I like to think that I'm a very wine drinker, a consumer focused winemaker. And that's really important. You've always got to understand that for a lot of the time, you're not making wine for you. You're not making wine for your own tastes. You're making wine for someone else, and you're trying to understand the market and the wine drinker and understand what they want. And hopefully, a good winemaker is someone who can do that, can realize that, and make a product that resonates with the wine drinker.
Yeah, super interesting, that balance. And I'm sure at the same time you want to be able to cater to the consumer, but also make wines that are pleasing to you as well.
No, definitely, and I think that it's got to be pleasing to you as a winemaker, and I think that's probably the other part that I didn't touch on earlier is that what makes my wine or the next winemaker's wines different or special, and I think that if you're making wines that, of course, resonate and appeal to the consumer, but also appeal to you, then you're always going to have your own personal stamp on those wines, and that's the fantastic thing about wine is the variation. Every region is different, every variety is different, and then you put the grapes in the hands of a different winemaker, and again, you get a different result. And so that's what's so fascinating about it is every time you pick up a wine bottle, you're going to get something different and something that might be unexpected and hopefully delicious.
So would you say that when you make wine, you go in with a certain sort of expectation about how you want to make the wine, or do you allow the fruit to sort of dictate the type of wine you're going to create?
Yeah, really good question, and it really depends on what style you're making. If it's a very consumer focused, perhaps a larger production wine, very much I generally start with the end point, being the wine drinker, being the consumer, and work back from there and say, look, what are they looking for at the price point that we're offering for this wine, and work back and try and create a style that resonates with that consumer. But then you'd look at something like our Claven wines, which are our top end single vineyard site wines. And those are very different. That's not going anywhere near the consumer, really. It's listening to the vineyard rather than the consumer and saying, what does the vineyard want? How do we do the best expression of this single site that we possibly can? And put something in the bottle that really respects the vineyard. And then from there, the consumer has that journey when they taste the wine, that journey back to the vineyard to where it came from. So two very different ways of looking at it. And I suppose at Giesen, we've got quite a wide range of wines, so we certainly do both.
That totally makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about the thing that's probably on everybody's mind. It's on my mind. And that is, how did you go from making regular, if you want to call them that, regular wines, and get into zero alcohol wines?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and because it is quite a journey from one to the other, it really is. And I think zero alcohol wine has really only been around in a big sense for the last few years. For us in New Zealand, we had been making some lower alcohol wines for a number of years, wines that are naturally lower in alcohol, about 9% or 9.5% alcohol. And they were really lovely wines. But we'd always wondered, look, is there a space for zero alcohol wine? Is there a chance to make something with no alcohol in it that people are going to enjoy drinking in the occasion that they do not drink alcohol, whether they're driving or they're having a month off in dry July or dry January? And then past that, probably the last thing that really sort of pushed us to do it, or not pushed us to do it, but sort of made us think of the idea, was we did a health and well-being initiative at Giesen, and that was in 2019. And it was a month of counting calories and counting steps, and it also meant that you couldn't drink alcohol for a month. Well, I signed up for this pretty quickly. I thought it was a great initiative, as did the rest of the winemaking team. And then probably just as quickly, we all realised that we couldn't drink alcohol for a month, so we couldn't drink wine for a month, and that was a bit of a crisis moment. So we went to the local wine stores and tried to find zero alcohol wine, and there wasn't much available. And what was available was okay. We didn't get a lot of flavor out of it. So quite literally, we said, look, can we make one? Can we take a Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand and remove the alcohol successfully and make something that we think would work? And we had a try, and we liked what we saw. And I suppose, as they say, the rest is history.
And what would you say is the biggest challenge of making a zero alcohol wine?
It's to be honest, it's probably the same as the biggest challenge with regular wine. It's balance. And with any wine, you've got to balance something depending on where you are in the world. If you're in a really hot climate, for example, in South Australia, you might be trying to balance alcohol. Of course, that's the absolute opposite of what we're doing with zero alcohol wines. In New Zealand, you're trying to balance acidity because we're blessed with lovely fresh acidity, but sometimes you've got to work around that and balance it. With zero alcohol wine, as soon as you remove the alcohol, things like the acidity really stand out. So you've got to find a way to balance that. And so you do things like trying to pick fruit that is a little bit lower in acidity, and that means that you can create a wine that is more balanced. What we do with our wines, we made a conscious decision not to balance the acidity with sugar. We didn't want a sweet style, and we wanted it to be lower in calories than the rest. And we're also really conscious that, look, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc isn't a sweet wine style, so we didn't want it to have obvious sweetness. So we were prepared to create a wine that maybe looked a little bit too tart, but then after a couple of sips or a glass, that refreshing acidity and the dryness becomes quite appealing, rather than the build-up of a sweet cloying sensation.
Makes sense. So, yeah, because that is the New Zealand style. Are there a lot of zero alcohol wine makers that are adding sugar to their wines?
Look, I think that certainly most of the zero alcohol wines on the market are sweeter than ours. I mean, you'd be a lot of them are around 40 or 50, sometimes 60 grams per liter sugar. For example, our Sauvignon Blanc is 15 grams of sugar per liter, so it is noticeably drier. And like I said, we often find that means when people take their first sip, it can look quite sour. But then we encourage people to have a couple of sips, and especially to try it with food, which is when you'd probably be drinking it, and then it starts to make a bit more sense, and that acidity becomes refreshing and moreish, and hopefully that style's sort of working for us.
Well, I'm glad you said what you said, because we talk on our podcast, we talk a lot about the idea that wine and food really should go together. And it sounds to me that for the wines you make and in the style that you make them, especially that pairing of food and wine is really important to the experience of the wine.
100%, and I suppose it goes back to the point I made earlier, where we try and make wines that really work with the consumer, with the wine drinker. And so we said to ourselves when we were developing them, how are people going to drink them? And we thought they're probably going to drink them with family and friends, and they're probably going to have them with food. That's where zero alcohol wine can be a great accompaniment to food, other than soft drinks or sodas that are loaded with sugar and don't go very well with food. So when we develop them, like when you're making a regular wine, you do taste tests, and you generally have a little sip of each one and you choose which one is right. Well, with the zero alcohol wine, we took it to another level. We actually said, okay, with the winemaking team, choose your favorite one of these three. And let's say, for example, we were looking at sugar levels. Choose your favorite one, and then take a bottle home and drink it. And you often find that when you do that, your opinion changes, because when you have a small sip, you'll probably go for the sweeter version. But when you take it home and actually taste it with your food and drink a glass or two glasses, you start to find that sugar really becomes quite annoying, and it sort of changes the experience. So that was quite a different way, a different approach for how we made those wines, and I think it worked for us.
It's really amazing. So a question for you, and then I want to talk about how you make the wine zero alcohol, because I think it's different than most people think. But I know the first thing I want to ask is just, how have you seen the growth of zero alcohol wine? Are you seeing more people interested in it? I mean, I'll be honest, I think you mentioned this. I only found out about it a little, maybe a couple of years ago. And I honestly thought, well, I wonder if it actually is wine or if it's some sort of juice instead. And it's not. But first question is, how are people responding to zero alcohol wine? And do you see it as a growing category?
Yeah, I guess for the first part of the question, in terms of how people respond, well, It's really interesting. It's fascinating watching people try these wines and seeing what their reaction is. And most of the time, if someone's going to drink a zero alcohol wine, they're almost certainly going to be a wine drinker. Because if they weren't a wine drinker and they didn't want to drink alcohol, they'd probably drink soft drinks or water or whatever. So they know what wine tastes like, and they're probably quite familiar with wine. And it doesn't matter how hard you try and how good your zero alcohol wine is, it tastes different. The alcohol has a huge influence on the flavor of wine. So when people try it for the first time, there is a bit of surprise. Something's not there, something's missing, and that's the sweetness and the richness and the heat of alcohol. So you do find that it's a bit of a polarizer. A lot of people like it, some people don't. But we're finding that people are loving that the option is there, and they're loving that they can have, food with a wine without alcohol, and they can get as close as possible to that wine drinking experience without alcohol. And perhaps people feel less excluded if they go out for dinner with friends or a barbecue or whatever, and everyone else is drinking regular wine and they're driving or they don't drink. It's really nice that people have that option. And then and we get a lot of great feedback, which is fantastic, really, really satisfying. We do get some lovely feedback for the wines. In terms of the category as a whole, I think that there was probably a bit of a mad rush early on where people were fascinated to see what are these products, what are they like? And we certainly saw that. And then since then, we've seen really good growth. It's been quite fascinating. We didn't really know where the growth was going to come from. We probably expected it was people who can't drink or choose not to drink alcohol at all. In actual fact, most of the growth is coming from moderators, people who are just trying to reduce their regular intake of alcohol. And they're doing that by, 2 or 3 nights a week, they're drinking zero alcohol wine instead of regular wine. Or some people will have a glass of full alcohol wine followed up by a glass of zero. And it's just a nice way of reducing your total alcohol intake. And I think for me, that's the future of the category. I think that's where the growth is going to continue to be. I think wine will be a really important part of that growth as the wines get better. I think we will see more improvement with the quality of zero alcohol wines. And then I think we'll also see other innovative products come through as well in that sort of zero alcohol space that are going to be quite interesting to watch.
That totally makes sense to me. As I get older, I find that I love the taste of wine. I love drinking wine and eating food, but sometimes it's I can't enjoy as much of it as I want because of the alcohol. And so it's a great alternative. And there's so many reasons why I can see people wanting to have the option of a zero alcohol wine. I think, and you also talked about the experience. I think what I've had to get used to in terms of drinking zero alcohol wine is there is a distinct difference, it feels like to me, and you tell me because you're the wine expert, but there's something about the body as well. The body of the wine kind of feels a little bit different initially, and you kind of have to get used to that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Alcohol is so important to the body of wine, and without it, it really is impossible to get that level of depth and body without alcohol. Or at least it is at the moment, and that's where again you can replace that alcohol with sugar, but we really choose not to. We don't want a sweet wine. What is interesting with the zero alcohol wine category, of course, is that in America, for example, these wines are not wines; they're classified as food products. So that does open the door to what you add. You can add other things to them to sort of emulate the body and even the heat or the texture of alcohol. And we might see more of that with our wines. We've been really conscious that we don't do any of that. We only add what you would add to a regular wine. And we really want that integrity with the product. We want people to know that they are literally drinking a regular wine that's just had the alcohol delicately removed and nothing else added. And for me, I think that has quite a lot of value, and it's nice for the consumer to know that.
Well, you've chosen the perfect segue because the next question is, how do you get rid of the alcohol in the wine? And I'll be honest, when I first was learning about zero alcohol wines, I didn't understand the process. And then the concept that you're making a regular wine or a alcohol, a wine with alcohol and then removing it was sort of eye-opening to me. So, and I understand that Giesen again has this maybe unique way of removing the alcohol from the wine. So maybe for our listeners, explain how you make a zero alcohol wine.
Without doubt, the first most important step is the regular wine that you make. So you've got to make a regular, full alcohol wine first. And the quality of that full alcohol wine is going to have a direct bearing on the quality of the zero alcohol wine. Much the same way as you can't make good wine from bad grapes, you can't make good zero alcohol wine from bad regular wine. So you've got to have a really good wine to start off with. And the wine that we use to make our zero alcohol wine is made exactly the same way as our regular wines. A couple of things: we look at the acidity levels, like I mentioned before, and choose sometimes riper fruit with less acidity to help balance that. But otherwise, they're made exactly the same way. And then you've got to remove the alcohol with having as little impact on the flavor and texture of the wine as possible. And one of the fastest ways to spoil a wine and to interrupt the flavor and the aroma is with heat. So if you have a bottle of wine that gets too hot in the sun or in the back of a car, straight away, especially something like a Sauvignon Blanc, it's going to lose those lovely characteristic aromas. So however you remove the alcohol, you've got to do it with as little heat as possible. And that's where we bring in the technology called spinning cone. Now, spinning cone sounds pretty scary. It's actually very simple. It's basically a very simple form of distillation, because of course we've got to distill the alcohol out of the wine. But there's a couple of things there that help us do it at very low temperatures. And one of them is that a spinning cone operates under a vacuum. So it's a vacuum distillation. And under a vacuum, you can distill alcohol at much lower temperatures. And then you've got the spinning cone part, which is probably the bit that really differentiates it. And inside the spinning cone, you've got a series of upturned cones that spin, hence the name, the spinning cone. And the wine flows down on top of these cones and flows from one cone to the next cone. And that creates a massive surface area. And with that surface area under a vacuum, it means that we can remove the alcohol at really, really low temperatures. So that's very, very important. One thing we do, which is, if you like, it's almost a bit of a lesson from the perfume industry. Now, in the perfume industry and in the coffee industry, spinning cone is used to extract and concentrate flavor and aroma. So, for example, if you're trying to concentrate the aroma of roses, you can use a spinning cone to put a solution of rose water through and concentrate that aroma. Well, we use the same philosophy with our wines. So let's take a Sauvignon Blanc. We put the Sauvignon Blanc through the spinning cone first at very, very low temperatures. And the first thing we distill is all of the aroma of the Sauvignon Blanc, because that has a lower distillation point than alcohol. So we basically create a Sauvignon Blanc perfume. And then we can turn up the temperature very slightly on the spinning cone, because we don't have to protect the aroma anymore because we've removed it. Turn up the temperature slightly and then remove all of the remaining alcohol. So at this stage, we've now got a wine with no alcohol and no aroma. So probably not the most interesting wine in the world. But then we take some of that Sauvignon Blanc perfume, if you like, and add it back in to bring the aroma back. And that's one of the key things we do. And I can't say too much more than that, because I'll give away all of our secrets. But that's one of the key parts of what we do to hopefully make ours a bit more aromatic and recognizable as a Sauvignon Blanc.
It's just fascinating. It's amazing. So, and I think you mentioned this, that I'm not sure if it's still the most common technique, but a common technique for removing alcohol is to heat the wine, and that does really negatively impact the flavor.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So all wine is, of course, the aroma is coming from very delicate aroma compounds. In the case of Sauvignon Blanc here in New Zealand, the tropical fruit flavors and everything you associate with the variety are coming from something called thiols, and they're very sensitive to heat. Then you take something like a Riesling and you have esters and terpenes and all of these wonderful things that give every wine its flavor and aroma, very susceptible to heat. So if it is exposed to heat for any length of time, it's going to change the flavor and aroma of the wine, generally in a negative way.
So I have a just sort of a side question for you. Do you feel like you need to continue to drink full alcohol wine to keep you sort of honest as you make the zero alcohol wine? Is that part of your process?
That's a really good question. Look, I think for me personally, I think I'd struggle to think of life without drinking regular full alcohol wine, because I love wine so much. So I'm very much in that moderator category. I do drink our zero alcohol wines, and I'm a big believer in drinking to a certain degree, drinking the wines that you make, so that you understand the experience from a consumer level. It's really important. But I drink them here and there to reduce my total alcohol intake. But I love wine. I mean, at the moment, I'm halfway through studying Master of Wine. And so as part of that, I have to taste a lot of different wines from around the world. And if I'm opening a lovely bottle with my wife at home here in Marlborough, we're definitely going to drink it. We're not going to spit it out. So certainly for me, I will, in this stage at least, intend to carry on drinking regular wine as well.
Yeah, makes sense to me. And then Giesen has just recently released, I think this is correct. You've just recently released a zero sparkling brut. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so that's the latest release in the range. We've got a few varieties now, and the latest one is a sparkling brut, made from a blend of white varieties. And the idea there is just to make a really lovely, fun, playful, crisp, refreshing zero alcohol sparkling. It's a lot of fun. It's nice and dry, subtly fruity, lovely, clean aromas of sort of pear and apple. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think for us, it was, wine, of course, is associated with family and friends and food, but it's also associated with celebration. And we really wanted to be able to release a wine that could give people that experience without the alcohol.
I found it fascinating in the wine, in the sparkling brut, because it is a zero alcohol. I found it fascinating that there was sort of the sense of yeast in the smell and the aroma of the wine. Is that part of the spinning cone process to that, or is that just a fact of making the wine?
Yeah, it's when we made it, we didn't want a wine that was too sort of bready and yeasty, like like a champagne or a Méthode Traditionnelle. We wanted it to sort of celebrate the New Zealand sort of clean fruit sort of style that people are used to, but we did want a little bit of that characteristic, and we get that characteristic from a little bit of extended lees aging on some of the components before we make the wine. Of course, with regular Méthode Traditionnelle, that yeasty bready characteristic comes from contact with lees in the bottle before it's disgorged. But we don't do that with zero alcohol wine because it's not bottle fermented. So a little bit of lees contact prior to blending is why we get that characteristic, and hopefully it sort of gives people a little bit of that slightly sort of yeasty, champagne-y characteristic. But it's more of a simple, playful, fruity style. Personally, I actually really love it with a splash of orange juice to make a non-alcoholic mimosa. It's a wine you can have a bit of fun with and have a play with. You don't have to just drink it out of a champagne glass. You can have a bit of fun with it, which is quite cool.
And how have people been reacting to the wine?
Yeah, so far really good. We've had a lot of good feedback from trade and from people who've tried it. And look, it's only recently in the market, so I suppose the big one is how well does it operate in the market? How well are sales going to be over the next few months? Fingers crossed it goes well. We're pretty happy with the style. Now, every time we make a new zero alcohol wine, it's a bit of a first. We started with Sauvignon Blanc, and we did Pinot Gris and Rosé, Riesling, and a red as well. And we're very conscious that every time we make them again, we want to make them better and better. And I think that now other people are getting into the zero alcohol category. That the competition is there. We've got to try and stay ahead of the pack. So it is really important. I'm really happy with the style, with the dryness, the freshness, the cleanness. But absolutely, every time we make it, we'll try and make it a little bit better each time.
That's great. And if you're like us, I know we're kind of in the holiday season as we're recording this, but my wife and I like to say that you should have sparkling wine any day. It's not something just to be saved for special occasions. Like Tuesday is a special occasion to have a sparkling wine.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think, I know my wife always loves to have at least one bottle of bubbles in the fridge at the ready and any day of the week. So, no, it's great. Sparkling wine is great because whether it's Christmas time or a celebration or whether it's just, like you said, a Tuesday, it's always a delicious, refreshing style of wine, and it's just fun. No, I totally agree.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so what is next for you as a winemaker and Giesen? What's next in the zero alcohol category?
Yeah, well, we're going to be continuing to watch the category very, very closely. And like I said before, we do really like to do that. It's very important to how we operate, is watch the category, watch people's reactions to the wines, both in person and in market feedback. We see that there's an awful lot of growth still to be had in the zero alcohol category in wine and in other products. So we'll continue to innovate. I think you'll see other varieties being produced by us, other great varieties, other styles, and just continue to try and innovate. I think that more and more consumers expect that innovation. They want something surprising and interesting quite regularly, and so we can't just have a range of zero alcohol wines and say that's it, we're done. We've got to keep trying to challenge ourselves and then challenge people's perceptions of what's available in the zero alcohol space. So I think from us, absolutely expect innovation. We hope to see growth, and we hope to see that our wines continue to sort of perform well on a world stage in the zero alcohol category.
Well, once again, your segues are amazing because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, as you've grown as a winemaker, changed how you've, approached wine, what's something, and this is kind of a broad question, but something surprising or interesting or exciting or even, funny or fun that you've learned about yourself on your journey?
Yeah, do you know what? I think I've probably mostly just learned to be less of a wine snob, actually. It's quite funny because I think when I first got into the wine industry, I don't think I was a wine snob as such, but I said earlier, my passion was just about the small scale, very high end wine, the sort of wines that you see in fancy restaurants and that are inaccessible to the vast majority of wine consumers. And look, those wines are amazing, and they're fantastic wines. And when in those rare occasions you get to drink them, they can be life altering almost in terms of how good they are. But more and more, I've learned that wine is something that is there for everybody, all adults, and it's there to be, had enjoyed with family and friends and have a bit of fun with it. So I think more and more, I'm learning to take that more consumer-driven and wine drinker approach. It probably takes me back to those first experiences I had with wine when I grew up in Cyprus, and that was just going out for dinner with my parents and families and friends and seeing all the adults around the table just drinking the local village wine out of a carafe on the table. And it was wonderful memories. But when I think about that now, that's the great part of wine. That's not fine wine drinking. That's just having fun with family and friends and drinking what's available locally. And in that circumstance, that wine is the best wine you could possibly have in the world because it fits the circumstance so well. So I think for me, that's probably what I've surprised myself is that I think become more and more understanding of the wine consumer as a whole, hopefully.
Well, once again, Duncan, you are amazing at segues. And so, my next question is first of all, you are invited to our home in Seattle. And every Sunday, we have with our family, we do Sunday night dinner. We're Italian American family. So, you can just imagine there's a lot of Italian food and a lot of Italian people, and there's a lot of noise. And it's really fun. And we always have wine with dinner because that's what you do. You have wine and food together. Even the younger people have a little bit of wine, like you talked about, and it's about family and it's about fun and it's about being together. So you're invited. You're coming over. This is a real thing. Like you are really invited. But when you come to Sunday night dinner, we want you to bring some of your wine. So what wines would you bring to share with us?
Oh, brilliant question. Well, first of all, we would love to come over for dinner. That would be absolutely fantastic. And I think what I would like to bring would be a few examples of what we do at Giesen, both some zero and some non-alc and some full alcohol wines. Now, listening to what you're sort of saying in terms of food, I would say the zero alcohol would probably be a good place to start. And I'd start off with our zero alcohol Riesling, which is a really lovely Spätlese style. It's sort of off dry or medium sweet even, lovely acidity, but it's got a nice sweetness and that lovely kind of lemon and limey characteristic you get with the Riesling. And that one would be a lovely way to start with some antipasties. It'd be beautiful with the sort of the saltiness of cured meats and olives and things like that. Perfect. And then, of course, coming from Marlborough here in New Zealand, I'd have to then follow that on with a really nice Sauvignon Blanc, and I would bring our top tank fermented Sauvignon Blanc called the Uncharted, and that's a lovely wine. It's just everything that you expect from Marlborough. It's punchy and aromatic, tropical fruit, citrus fruit, grapefruit, and that's a lovely wine with something like Pasta Primavera or something because it has some subtle green characteristics to it, green bean and tomato stalk. And then probably from there, I'd probably finish off with, I reckon, probably my two favorite wines from our portfolio. And that would be our Claven Pinot Noir, which is a small production single vineyard wine. It's a lovely, rich Pinot that's just beautiful with just about any food, whether it's meat or non-meat. And then finally, finish off with a wine from the same vineyard, our Claven Syrah. That's a real rarity here in Marlborough. You don't see much Syrah, but the Syrah we make, when we make it in a good year, it can be absolutely fantastic. And our 2021 just won a top international Syrah at the International Wine Challenge in London, which is the biggest wine competition in the world. So it's a lovely wine, and it's a great way to sort of show the world that Marlborough can do something that's not just Sauvignon Blanc. And I think with some beautiful Italian meat dishes, that wine would go down pretty well, I reckon, Joe.
I mean, you couldn't have answered that any better. I mean, some of our very favorite wines in there, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, especially Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, Pinot Noir. I'm crazy about Pinot Noir and the Syrah. That would be, but you're in. You're in. When are you coming?
Oh, you just mentioned it. I'll get on the plane. You say the date. I'm there.
All right. Very good. Very good. Well, Duncan, it's just been an absolute pleasure talking with you and learning more about your wine journey, how you make wine, how this fascinating process of making zero alcohol wine. And you're just a great person to talk to. I'm sure you guys have a lot of fun in the winery. Before you go, I'd love for you to share how people can find you and find Giesen and find the wines and make sure that they're tasting this wonderful beverage that you're creating.
Absolutely. Well, look, we're pretty active on social media, and so our social handle is at Giesen Wines, Giesen Wines, all one word. And then our website in the USA is giesenwines.com. So have a look at the website. You will see the range of wines. There'll be a little bit of information about us at Giesen and our vineyards, and which is nice. And also you'll find a list of our stockists on that website as well. So hopefully everything's there for everyone to, if they want to give them a go, you can find our wines out there in the market and give them a try.
Yeah, I think in the United States, you can find Giesen at Whole Foods. You can find them at Total Wine. You can also find them at Kroger grocery stores. So lots of opportunities to find it. And I would strongly suggest that people seek it out now that you know the Winemaker. Well, thank you very much, Duncan, for the time. Looking forward to meeting you in person someday. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm looking forward to that dinner.
Awesome. Well, we want to thank you very much for listening to our interview with Duncan, the chief winemaker at Giesen Wines. And now you know you can make great non-alcoholic or zero alcohol wines. And just in case you're worried about memorizing all the information we shared, don't worry. You can find out all this information on our website, thewinepairpodcast.com, in our show notes for this episode. But just so you have it, here's some links. You can go to the website at giesenwines.com. That's Giesen wines.com. The Instagram is at Giesen Wines. That's Giesenwines. And then you can find a link to places where you can buy Giesen wine, but they are available at Whole Foods, at Total Wine, at Kroger grocery stores, and Boisson, which I don't know, but there you go. If you have those shops and stores in your region, you can find Giesen wines there. But we also hope you will subscribe to our podcast, The Wine Pair Podcast, and follow us on Instagram and visit our website at thewinepairpodcast.com, where you can reach out to us and you can sign up for our amazing and fabulous newsletter. And you can also reach out to me at joe@thewinepairpodcast.com if you want more information, and we look forward to hearing from you. But for now, it's time to go. And as we like to say, life is short, so stop drinking shitty wine. Bye-bye.